underneath the sun.
Underneath the sun.
You know you gotta put one foot in front of the other.
Front of the other.
And you'll be doing just what Granny D has done. Oh, if you want to get folks all together, for the time test, you know it must be done.
Yes, it must be done.
Well, you know you gotta put one foot in front of the other.
Front of the other.
And you'll be doing just what Granny D has done. Walking down the road, doing something good. Walking down the road, she believes she could. Walking down the road, walking down the road, and she's feeling so smile. You'll be wearing it for many and many a while.
Many, many miles.
It will lift your voice while you are walking.
While you're walking.
And maybe try a dancing step or two.
Dancing step or two.
Well, you know the mighty echoes of the land resounding.
Echoes resounding.
We'll be bringing back the joyous song to you.
The song to you.
Walking down the road, doing something good. Walking down the road, but she believes she could. Walking down the road, and she's giving us all time. We'll be wearing it for many and many other miles. Yes, we'll be wearing it for many and many other miles.
Many, many miles.
Well, thank you so much, Leslie Vogel and Fred Simmons, the band formerly known as Tattoo, now known as Folk Soul, playing their Granny D song to start us off. We'll do a virtual round of applause to the music. My name is Olivia Zink, and I'm the Executive Director here at Open Democracy. And I'd really welcome you to today's celebration to Doris's 111th birthday. And she, as the founder of our organization, really is somebody we celebrate. Larry Haddock, since you're here and your sound is going, I'm going to ask you to start off today's program. Larry is Granny D's grandson and will be sharing a few of Doris's words.
In 2004, August of 2004, when Nana was running for the U.S. Senate, she had a speech in August at the Frost Farm in Derry, New Hampshire. And Robert Frost was her husband, Jim Haddock's English teacher while he was at Amherst. So he had a really special place in the Haddock family as a poet. And it was a fantastic place for her to give a speech, which was very well attended. And in Dennis's book, this speech he titles The Road Less Traveled. It's a rather long speech, and so I am just going to read excerpts from it that I felt were pretty special. Who we are and who we want to be as Americans. We want to be just an honorable people, trustees of a beautiful land and gardeners of a great democracy. We want to be a fiery, free people, good providers to each other and good neighbors to our townsmen and to the other people of the world. This American spirit is an aspiration that defines not only who we are to ourselves, but to the rest of the world in how they want to think of us. It is what they love about us, and they do. And despite all our hard times, our wars, our depressions, our genocides, our suppressions and oppressions, it is still a most beautiful country filled with most wonderful people, and we are still young. We have come to a new time, and we and our natural world are poised now at a parting of the road. One path leads where powerful nations have gone before. It is the road of silver and blood, the short, noisy road of empire. The other path, no great nation has taken before. The only way we can take this less traveled road is to blow off the ashes from the still living fire of our revolution. It is a revolution, though we look always for a peaceful way, as peace has more power by far when used rightly. By the end of this century, America will be a different place depending on which road we take at this moment. I can imagine half a century down the road, a ruined landscape, a broken spirit among the people, a fearful compliance in the machinery of death and not life. Other nations have gone that way. They ended poorly. Their people suffered. I can also imagine the end of this century quite differently. I can imagine the great Appalachian Mountains in all their beauty, the coal operators long gone, and the people again making 1,000 uses of the bounty of nature. I can imagine great arrays of solar cells and all the new energy technology, harvesting energy that we need here from our natural resources, from natural processes. I can imagine a people who look to their children as the nation's greatest resource, and they nurtured them with an imaginative and engaging education and a perfection of healthcare. I can imagine a nation where freedom and creativity of people bloom on a daily display of great joy and abundance. In this vision of the future, it is the small business and the creative enterprise and this family-sized group that drives the economy so efficiently and in the balance with nature and surroundings. The people are tired of this corrupt and dying system, and we are a special people in the world, and the world knows it very well. They look to us now to shake off this misdirection, this misleadership, this long nightmare. So let us do this thing that no great powerful nation has done before. Let us take the less traveled path. Thank you.
Great. Thank you to Granny Dee's grandson for sharing some of her words. We now have Representative Ivy Vann, who has co-sponsored the Granny Dee bill, and I'd like her to share a few words about that legislation.
Sure. There we go. There I am. Hi, nice to see you all. Yes, it is a very easy piece of legislation. I just asked them to resubmit the bill that we had last year, and it has been submitted. It has a number of co-sponsors and will come to the House at some point this spring. I'm not sure where it will go. That's a sort of interesting question, but I don't anticipate that it's going to meet with any difficulties. I was thrilled to be able to do it as a person who knew Granny Dee very, very slightly toward the end of her life when I was the nursery school assistant at Cobb Meadow School when she was living there. So there we are.
Well, thank you, Representative Vann, and we are all here to support you and the effort to establish a Granny Dee Day.
Well, I think we're well on our way to doing that. I think by this time next year, we'll have an official day.
Yes. Next in our program is Dennis Burke. Dennis Burke is an author, spent many days and traveling with Doris Haddock. He's the author of both of Doris's book, The American Century, as well as this brand new book that Dennis helped us pull together, The Politics of Joys, which is Doris's speeches. I'll hand it over to Dennis Burke.
Thanks. Just to give you, thank you for introducing me as an author. That doesn't happen very often, but I have written some books, and it started with Doris. And it happened because I was camping in the Mojave Desert with her as she was still in California. And every night by campfire, sometimes she would be writing in her journal. And by the time she got to Phoenix, which is where my wife and I live, we were in the living room. And I said, Doris, you really have to take those notes and turn them into a book, because when you get to DC, basically your story's over. But if you have a book, you can still go on all the shows, and you can still talk about campaign finance reform for another year or two, because you'll be coming in as an author. And she said, well, I would if you would help me. And at the time, I was the head of Arizona Common Cause, and we had ballot initiatives, campaigns to run. And I said, I wish I could, but we'll find somebody for you. And my wife, Maureen, who is an Arizona Republic reporter, leaned over and said, Doris, he'll help you. And so that was it. The decision had been made. And so that's why I kept catching up with her on the road and interviewing her and taking her notes. And that's how that happened. Arizona is a funny place. Yesterday, the Arizona Republican Party censured John McCain's widow and Jeff Flake and our governor. I think they forgot Teddy Roosevelt and some others while they were at it. But it was interesting for her to get a lot of Arizona people as organizers for her. And it showed how nonpartisan her message really was. Let me say that I would like to tell a story that it hasn't been told very much. Once she got to DC, it wasn't the end of the project. She still had to get it through the Senate and the House, and that took basically almost 2 years. But the way she got it through the Senate was she walked continuously around the Capitol building, and it was freezing cold, freezing rain, and there was some tricks to it. I said, Doris, you really can't fast and walk continuously. And she said, well, do me a favor and I'll call Dick Gregory. She had met Dick Gregory on the road, and Dick Gregory had been known for his political fasts. And she said, find out how to do it. And so she had his phone number, and I called him, and he was at dinner, but he interrupted his family dinner. And he said, okay, well, here's what you need. And he started giving this list of different fruit juices and sucrose and all sorts of stuff that you would put in her thermos. And he said, it looks like water when you get finished. And I said, well, is that really fair, Dick? And he said, Dennis, politics is show business sometimes. You don't want her to die. Give her something to drink. And so that was part of the trick of her fasting walk. The other trick to it was she didn't go right around the Capitol. She made a little detour behind the Supreme Court. And the reason for that detour was there's a brownstone back there that is owned by the Moyers family. And John Moyers is somebody that she had met actually a short time before that in the DC jail, because 40 of us had been arrested in the Capitol Rotunda. And that was back when you didn't need a presidential invitation to do that. And so we had basically a campaign finance reform little event where she made a statement in the Capitol Rotunda, and they hauled us all away. And that was arranged nicely with the Capitol Police. But she had met John, and so she called John and said, can I maybe take little cat naps in your house behind the Supreme Court on my fasting walk? So that was trick number 2 for how she did that for nearly 2 days. But while she was walking, during business hours at any rate, those of us who were organizing around her could go through the Senate, talk to the senators' secretaries, and say, the only way we can get this lady out of this freezing rain is for appointments with senators. And so they had to give in. That's how she met with half the Senate, and in fact did change some votes. And that's another story. But when the Senate finally did approve the bill, there was a little celebration in John Moyers' house. And one of the people who was there in his little bow tie was a guy who was writing mostly for New York Magazine at the time. His name was Tucker Carlson. And he already had a reputation of being kind of cutthroat. And we knew that he wasn't a big fan of campaign finance reform. And I told Doris to watch out for him. And she said, I know who he is. And she said, you handle it. So here's how we handled it. Here's the article that he wrote for New York, not New Yorker, the New York Magazine at the time. Granny D is still on the road. She came to Washington last week to lead rallies in support of McCain-Feingold campaign finance reform bill. Quote, why don't you bring her back to your house? Asked the guy who was handling her press. He seemed to think she'd make a good interview, but didn't want to risk my being mean. Quote, that way you couldn't skewer her too much once your family fell in love with her, he added. I thought he was kidding. He wasn't. And the next night, Granny D was standing in my living room explaining campaign finance reform to 3 small children in pajamas. They were sleepy, but they perked up when she mentioned John McCain. My kids don't know anything about politics, but they understand John McCain. Most kids do. The bad guys tried to make John McCain criticize America. He wouldn't. The bad guys kept him in prison and tortured him. Therefore, John McCain is a hero. That was their understanding, but Granny D added a twist. Quote, John McCain, she explained, is very brave because he's going against most of his colleagues and stands up for campaign finance reform. My son looked confused. I could tell he wanted to ask if colleagues meant bad guys. There's something about campaign finance reform that can give otherwise normal people a faraway look. Warren Beatty once kept me on the phone. He goes on and on and on. But in fact, he wrote a very charming article about Doris's trek, which reminds me of one other background story about the New York Magazine. And that was when she was running for Senate in New Hampshire, which campaign she won, by the way. I'll have to put an asterisk on that. The whole purpose of her running was to swing the presidential vote into the blue, which is what happened by, I think, 7,000 votes. And she credited a lot of the organizing that went on to get older people and younger people to vote as part of the reason. But she never thought she could win the Senate. And I think would have been horrified if she had, like someone else we know. At any rate, so, during the middle of that campaign, New York Magazine called and they wanted to have her picture taken by Richard Avedon, the famous portrait photographer. And she interrupted the campaign to take a day off, and Jim drove her down to a New York studio. And it basically was for a feature in New York Magazine about interesting women in politics. And the person in the studio just before her, and Doris got to watch it happen, was Hillary Clinton. And Hillary arrived with 2 of her retinue, and they were arguing about what the senator should wear. By the way, Doris had met her before. We were in an elevator during the Senate debates, and all of a sudden, Hillary stepped in, and Doris was, really happy to meet her, and said, "Oh, Senator, my name is," and Hillary said, "Doris, we know who you are." It was a great moment. So at any rate, so they met again in Avedon's studio as her assistants were trying to find just the right thing for Hillary to wear for that. And finally, Avedon kicked the assistants out and said, and he grabbed this old work shirt that was sitting there in his studio. And he said, "Senator, would you mind putting this on?" And so she did, and that was a great photograph. It came out beautifully. But after Doris had her photo taken, he said, "I want to give you something." And he gave her a choice of books to take with her. And she selected one that actually had quite a bit of, I would say, erotic photographs in them. And as she was walking out, his assistant said, "Mrs. Haddock, I want you to know he never gives away his books. He never gives away his books." But that's the one she picked because even at age, 93 at that point, she was just full of fun. She loved everything beautiful. She loved to look at everything beautiful. She loved everyone beautiful. And she lived every one of her 100 years worth of days. And most of all, I would say she was an awful lot of fun. So let me end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. Dennis's book, The Politics of Joy, is available. You can click on the link in the chat to get yourself the copy of Doris's speeches, as well as the other books that Dennis has written about Granny D. I'm going to turn the program over to the former executive director of Open Democracy and one of our advisory board, Dan Weeks, to share his memories of Doris.
Good afternoon. What a joy to be with you all. And I'm just thinking here as I sit, Granny D lived more than 90 of her 100 years without the internet. We of course wish we were gathering in person, but I'm pretty convinced that she's zooming in from heaven and that she would totally approve in these circumstances of us gathering in this newfangled way over Zoom. So glad to be together. And I do think Granny D's here too. Just before I start, I'm honored to share a couple of words from our senior US Senator, Jeanne Shaheen, to mark this occasion. Senator Shaheen wrote, "Granny D marched her way across our country and into the hearts and minds of countless Americans. She worked tirelessly for campaign finance reform, making her mark for freer and fairer government. And she had a reputation for raising a little hell in the name of human rights, social action, and environmental action. She was and continues to be an inspiration for millions. Thank you for gathering today to honor and celebrate her legacy." Well, I'm so grateful to be with you on this special day. And really every opportunity I have to speak about Granny D is a gift to me, because it prompts me to go back to recollect precious memories that I have from knowing her, and also go back into her own words, words which really become truer and more uplifting for me with the passage of time. When I'm preparing to recall her or invoke her speeches, I usually start with some of those blockbuster speeches that many of you know, like the one she gave on the steps of the US Capitol back on February 29th of 2000. This was at the conclusion of her cross-country walk, 3,200 miles, and you remember how she invoked the brave spirits of Arlington Cemetery, and then how she observed that this temple of our fair republic, the Capitol building, was being turned into a body house. And man, as I was thinking about that lately, that image and how apt that is when we recall the frightening images we saw just this past January 6th. But today, partly in response to those tragic events just a few weeks ago, but also in honor of the more hopeful scene that unfolded there at the Capitol just this past Wednesday, I wanted to go to one of Granny D's lesser known speeches, along with some personal reflections, a speech that she delivered back on April 4th of 2003. She was at that point thousands of miles into another journey of hers, not quite as famous as the walk. This wasn't by foot, but in her rickety old camper van, Rosie. And frankly, it wasn't that much better than walking by foot at the age of 93. It was always breaking down. But her purpose on that journey was to practice democracy by registering poor and minority women to vote. She would go into housing projects, laundromats, all sorts of places, and find folks who had really been locked out of American democracy and help them to exercise this most basic right. That particular day, it was a kind of literal continuation of Martin Luther King Jr.'s Poor People's Movement. And on that April day in 2003, she was invited to speak on that very same balcony of the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee, to mark the 35th anniversary of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King, who was, by the way, 19 years her junior, her birthday not too far after his, and of course, someone she greatly admired. And she ascended to the balcony of the Lorraine Motel, and she spoke these words just from the end of her speech, and they touched me so deeply as I was going back to them. She said, "Love is more powerful than violence. It is cleansing and liberating and energizing and joyful. Love washes away despair and fear. Love is freedom, and freedom is love. By the simple act of declaring our love and respect for one another, we are on the mountain King could see. All violence is down below us. All injustice is down below us. It nips at our heels, but we do not stop walking. We do not stop climbing. Dr. King and so many other great souls still walk with us, climb with us every day, every night, every moment that we embrace our lives as our own. Embrace our nation as our own, embrace each other as our brothers and sisters in the great community we are ever building, no matter what. And for me, and I know for many of you, Granny D's cause, yes, it was always democracy, but her currency, if you will, that was always love. It was apparent to me from the very first time I met her. I was 17 years old, a student at Conval High School in Peterborough, and she had recently finished her walk in 2000 and came and gave a commencement address there at Conval. And she, in the process, really put wind in the sails of an upstart student campaign that I was part of. We called ourselves Democracy in Practice. She became one of our advisors. And in addition to giving us energy for the work, she also gave us focus, gave us direction. You know, we'd begun as kind of a generalized campaign of getting students thinking about citizenship and voting. And she really pointed us to tackle that root problem at the heart of our democracy, which was the corruption of big money in politics. Over the ensuing decade, she made her cause my cause. She inspired me to join in that work. And I was privileged many times to join her on the road, to do walks and talks for campaign finance reform around New Hampshire, along with our dear friend John Rao and many of you. She became a founding board member of the organization. John started Americans for Campaign Reform, which continues as issue 1 today. And throughout all that time, you know, I was a kid. She was a national celebrity, international celebrity. But throughout our every interaction, it was always apparent just how generous, how kind, how loving she was, giving me opportunities that I didn't deserve to accompany her on this work. And so to wrap up, I could go on for a while, but I've been thinking about what her practice of love looks like today, how we respond today. And so I wanted to close by paraphrasing a couple of her different speeches, where she challenged us to see that we need more than just worthy candidates who represent our interests and values. And we've seen a change in this election. But we also need active citizens who thirst for a fair and just democracy and who are prepared to pay a price. She'd ask, are we putting our bodies in the way of an unjust system? And for some, it might include nonviolent civil disobedience, like she practiced, even taking that trip to jail. For others, the march in Washington could be followed by, as she said, a gin and a tonic and a pedicure. After all, as she said, this is a wonderful country and there's something for everyone, always keeping her sense of humor. But the main thing I think she would insist is that our revolution against oppression and unfairness be a joyful revolution. She'd say we must never forget that our great political struggle is also a struggle for the human soul, for courage and community and freedom, friendship and big dreams. She'd say what a wonderful, challenging time in which we live. A time when so much is at stake and when we all have so much important work to do together. A time to reclaim democracy. And finally, lest we think these are just nice words, I do believe the last thing she would say is there's something you can do now, today. For those who haven't been following too closely, the bill that she helped instigate when John joined her on the walk and convinced her of the importance of public funding of elections as the next step beyond McCain-Feingold. The bill which I was privileged to work on to help craft, which so many of you have been involved in over many years, now known as the For the People Act, H.R. 1. We have never had a better chance than we have today to actually make H.R. 1 and now S1, the first Senate bill, into law. Just the other day, Pelosi and Schumer stood together in the Capitol saying this would be their first legislative agenda. It includes the work of John Lewis. She walked over the Edmund Pettus Bridge, recalling him just as she recalled MLK many times. This was the civil rights struggle too. It includes sweeping voting rights reforms, putting an end to voter suppression, also gerrymandering reform, putting an end to politicians picking their voting, real citizen-funded campaign finance reform, the Disclose Act. So much has been brought together in this seminal piece of legislation, S1, HR 1, and now is our best chance ever to pass it. So as Granny B would say, it's time to step out to reclaim our democracy. And if you're not already active with Open Democracy, helping to make this reform law, now is the time to do it. We can honor Granny D by carrying on this work and making some real progress this year. So thanks so much for having me. It's an honor to be with you, and look forward to hearing next from our former Congresswoman, Carol Shea-Porter.
Great. Great.
Great. And without further ado, I'm going to introduce former Congresswoman Carol Shea-Porter from New Hampshire and a member of our advisory board. Carol's joining us by phone today.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry I have to do this by phone, but for some inexplicable reason, our internet went out. So we have to go back, as Olivia said, to the old-fashioned phone. So I hope you all can hear me. And I'm so honored to be here talking to all of you today about Granny D, because I just loved her. I knew who she was long before I met her. I was a great admirer. I knew everything that she had done on the Hill and how she had influenced people for our benefit. And I certainly shared her beliefs about democracy and campaign reform. I read about her and I quoted her often, but nothing prepared me for the actual meeting Granny D, that full experience. I was really privileged to meet her during her campaign for the U.S. Senate. She was quite a force. She was really a big presence. I think many people didn't take her seriously at the beginning of that campaign, but they sure did by the end. On the day that I first met her, I was part of a parade in Portsmouth. We were all marching behind her, and she was strong. You know, she wasn't a large person, but she just sent out all this energy and this strength. So she led this parade, and we marched through the streets of Portsmouth. And when we arrived at our location, Granny stepped up without glasses. I remember being absolutely impressed with that, as well as what she said. Stepped up, and she just leveled Judd Gregg in her speech. She wasn't mean, because that was not her style, but she was pointing out all of the things that were happening in D.C., and she pointed out that what they were really sending back to the people, and I remember exactly, were bacon bits. She said that he was just giving us bacon bits. So standing there talking to us, she was kind, she was passionate, she was persuasive, eloquent, straight talking, all rolled into one powerhouse. And that speech reflected who she was and her strength and her values and her moral commitment. I knew she was right. So when I ran my first race for Congress and every race after that, I decided not to accept any corporate PAC money or DC lobbyist money. And I have to say that DC was not impressed, to put it mildly, and I had a great deal of difficulty with that decision, but I stayed with it. And I did have one person who wrote to me and kept encouraging me, and that was Granny D. I got lovely notes from her and continue to get those notes, encouraging me and talking about, you know, what we could accomplish. She just truly was a beautiful soul and cared about us. So when I look at her, I think how she spent her 100 years in service to America and to its people, even the people who didn't appreciate the fact that she was speaking out for them. And I never saw her like really just fall apart. I remember when 2010 decision came out on the money, that was difficult. It was really difficult. But I kept thinking, you know, Granny D knows that we can get back there. We can work on this, and eventually the power of the people will persevere. And so she served as a moral compass for me for my political career. As I said, I quoted her constantly, and I always liked this quote: democracy is not something we have, it's something we do. And I used to add that because I didn't think she minded, and if we don't do it right, we'll lose it. And I think the past 4 years have shown us how fragile democracy can be and why we have to constantly be defenders of our democracy and proponents for campaign finance reform and for democracy. So I'm grateful to have a chance to tell my one little or two little stories about Granny D, but I will say that she didn't just walk for us. She walked with us. And we walked with her. We continue to walk with her. And she's still marching in front of us with all of the things that she wrote and all of the people that she reached out to and persuaded. She walked in front of us then and still walks in front of us saying, don't fall down, don't get discouraged, don't give up. Democracy is worth it. So thank you for giving me the chance to talk, and I look forward to hearing our next speaker. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Carol Shea-Porter. we have a couple of more speakers to go, but I will tell you that our program is a little bit different than we envisioned this morning. I got a call right as we started that Bill Moyers is unfortunately got ill last night and is unable to be with us. He was hoping he would feel better by 2 o'clock today. And gratefully, Larry Lessig has stepped in to speak for Bill Moyers, and we also will have Bill McKibben to come join and share a memory. But before we go to those speakers, I'd like Leslie Vogel, who introduced us with music, to share a memory.
Hi, I'm hoping you can hear me now. I want to speak about the July 4th parade in Amherst, New Hampshire, which was the first time that Granny D walked for U.S. Senate for running for that campaign. And I'll read it as quickly as I can, and it's a little story. We were there with our musical instruments because we thought she might deserve her own personal marching band. It's a lot of waiting before the 4th of July parade starts. Bagpipers warm up on one side of the lawn, brass instruments flash in the sun, held by musicians dressed up in terribly hot uniforms. We are waiting by Granny D banners that are about 8 feet high. Doris, Granny D. Haddock, is running for U.S. Senate for the state of New Hampshire after the Democrats slated to run backed out. She is 94 years old. At the age of 89 and 90, she spent a year walking across the entire U.S. continent from Pasadena, California to Washington, D.C. in support of national campaign finance reform. She is a living example to all of us here, waiting to join her with our instruments for the simple reason that we believe she deserves her own marching band. Fred and David and I practice a few songs on trombone, guitar, and accordion that might be appropriate for Granny D. Just a Closer Walk with Thee is translated for our purposes into Just a Walk with Granny D, all the way to Washington, D.C. And The Little Old Lady from Pasadena, Go Granny, Go Granny, Go Granny, Go, Down by the Riverside, and other songs that echo through our history. After much waiting, we get to start off down the road, joining the parade. Granny D walks quickly with short, lively steps, waving and greeting people to the right and left. We have to step lively ourselves to stay with her, blasting cheerfully away at our songs, alternately singing and playing. As we go, we notice that people from both sides of the political fence are recognizing Granny D. They look, they wonder what the heck, and then their faces light up with smiles as they wave back to her, and even some of them greet her with a hug and a kiss. We are at the very tail end of the parade on this hot day in July. We make a cheerful caboose playing music that honors this remarkable woman. As we rounded the corner into the center of Amherst, cheers from a section of people on our right broke out for Granny D. Children wearing complicated arrays of stickers from both political parties clapped for everybody. They were collecting stickers from everybody and anybody on their shirts and were advertising a combination of political viewpoints that would make it interesting for them if all gathered in the same room. Just as it should be, I thought to myself, the divisions are no good. The children have it right, as usual. By the time we made it to the other end of the town, they were collecting stickers from everybody, and my head was pounding from the July heat. I collapsed onto the grass in the shade, thankful to sit down. But Granny D was still standing and talking to people. She's scheduled to go to Portsmouth and give a speech at 3 p.m. this afternoon. I'm just about done in after one parade. She is remarkable, and as I say, a great and shining example to the rest of us. We played many times for Granny D as she walked into many towns across the state of New Hampshire during her campaign. We would walk with her for a mile into town playing our instruments, and then we stood nearby listening while she made a speech at the gazebo or on the steps of an important building. It was just as it should be. We marched into town with the horns ringing echoes off the old buildings of the main street, and then we listened to a wise woman speak about what constitutes a fair democracy. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leslie, for sharing that memory. Next, we'll go to Larry Lessig, a Harvard professor, an author, and I think somebody who Granny D inspired. Larry, thanks for stepping in for Bill Moyers for us today.
Yeah, thanks for asking me, Olivia. It's a little tough because obviously you're disappointed to be hearing from me rather than Bill Moyers. But I am inspired by these talks and also the memories. I, unlike most of you, didn't get a chance to meet Granny D in person. I only met her virtually. And that's when she ran for Senate. She reached out to me and asked if she could be a guest blogger on my blog. And astonishingly, at whatever age that was, she was a vigorous blogger, regularly entering posts that got an extraordinary amount of response from people who were intrigued with this idea of her running for Senate. Those were the days before I realized that the problem she was focused on was the most important problem for us to focus on. And it was about 14 years ago from today that was the problem I began to take up. And I have on my desk in my office this extraordinary device that was given to me. It's called a Google Home device. And what Google Home device asks you to do is to upload all of your digital images from all of your devices, and it figures them out. And after about a week, it started, I did this about 6 months ago, it started feeding me images from the day. And so for the last 2 weeks, I've been blessed every day to be watching these images come across my Google Home device from a walk that many of you participated in that we had 7 years ago. The first of the walks that we did beginning on January 11th in Dixville Notch and ending on Nashua today in honor of Granny D's birthday. And it was a walk that we conducted to celebrate both what she was inspiring us all to take up, but in a context that demonstrated how tough we thought that fight was going to be. And it was impossible, I think, even 7 years ago, to imagine that what she had been fighting for was something that was within our grasp. I didn't think it was important to believe it was in our grasp, to believe that it was important to fight for it. Whether it was possible or not, we had to fight for it because we believed, as she did, that unless we had this reform, nothing else was going to be possible. But I am inspired by what Dan said, and I want to echo what he said. What is astonishing to recognize right now is that within our grasp, we have the most ambitious democracy reform package that Congress would have passed since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It's not just what Granny D was most famous in her fight pressing for, public funding of congressional campaigns. It's also gerrymandering reform and a restoration of the Voting Rights Act. And it's also extraordinary range of ethics reforms that would fundamentally change the business model, the economy of influence of Washington. And it's really extraordinary to recognize that it is within possibility, because not only has Nancy Pelosi delivered on her commitment in 2019 to pass it in the House, she has revived her commitment to pass it this year. And Chuck Schumer, even though he has a bare majority in the Senate, has made it his commitment to pass it. And even the most conservative Democrat in the Senate, Joe Manchin, has said that he believes public funding is a critical part of any reform package. And of course, our president has committed to signing this legislation. So we should never look forward to the day when we stop celebrating the extraordinary life that Granny D led and the extraordinary inspiration that she has led so many in the world to take up. But it is astonishing to believe that we could next year be looking back and recognize that the most important thing that she was fighting for, we have taken the first step to achieve. And that once we restore the potential for this democracy to respond not to the wealthy, not to the most influential with their power, but to ideas and good thought and civility, then there's a chance we can walk our government back into something that inspires everyone, both on the left and on the right. So I've been honored to be part of this movement in New Hampshire, this rebellion in New Hampshire. It's surprising that we might see the rebellion succeed. And I will be enormously happy to move on to a new project because it's been a long 14 years in this fight and many more years for many of you. So thank you for inviting me to pitch it for Bill Moyers. It's always an honor to have anything to do with this group and him. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Larry. Our next pitch hitter for Bill Moyers is Bill McKibben. Bill is the founder of 350, also an author and a professor, as well as, I believe, got arrested with Doris several years ago. So I'll turn the program over to Bill McKibben. Thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And what a pleasure to get to follow Larry. Even between the two of us, we're not quite add up to Bill Moyers, but we'll do our best. And greetings to you all. At least up here in the middle of Vermont, it may be the single prettiest day of the year. Just amazing bright sunshine on beautiful snow still hanging in the trees. So just a gorgeous day. You know, I think about Doris often, but I've thought about her a lot in the last 3 weeks or so, because we indeed, Olivia, were arrested together in the Capitol by the Capitol Police, who were operating with far more efficiency than they demonstrated on January 6th. They turned out to be very good at arresting us. In fact, it was quite a funny day. We were holding either side of a banner that said something like "Stop global warming, stop campaign contributions from global warmers" in the rotunda of the Capitol. And so we weren't obviously supposed to be there doing that. So they came and arrested us, and they handcuffed Granny D and I together. Which was funny because I'm 6'3" and she is not. And so I was sort of staring as they led us away, and she looked up at me, and I think that this was the first time that she had ever been arrested, because she looked up at me and said, "I'm 90 years old," or whatever she was at the time, 93 or something. She said, "I've never been arrested, but I should have started long ago," she said. So it was an excellent day. We spent the afternoon, the 10 or 12 of us who'd been arrested at the Capitol Hill Police Station, in the cell there, listening to her tell stories, and it was great. I just want to talk for a minute about her extraordinary abilities as an organizer, and I want to talk for a minute about also about just the power that she discovered in walking. I got to walk with her a few times on protests and things. I remember a year or two after that, walking into a couple of miles into the city of Concord at the end of some kind of march for what I truthfully can't quite remember. But I remember that she could walk fast. As one would expect, having made it across the country, she had gotten good at this, and which was fun for me because I like to walk fast too. And we kept getting ahead of the rest of the demonstration and having to wait for them to catch up. But I think that there was something that she discovered about walking that I discovered in the course of doing some long marches over many days, which is that in our world, they're one of the few chances you get to really just talk with someone without there being any need to cut to the chase. You're going to be going for the next couple hours, and So you might as well tell your story in full and really get to hear from someone else. And you know, there's nobody, you can't be doing all the things we do now, messaging someone or emailing someone or looking at Twitter or whatever it is. And so in and of itself, that was a very smart discovery she made that has gone on to, I mean, I guess she wasn't the first to figure it out. Gandhi had sort of the same idea. But in our time and place, it felt very different and powerful and useful. And I learned a lot from it. Something else that I think about more and more all the time, since I turned 60 this past year, is the idea that it's important and possible for people to have to come to work like this later in their lives. That you don't have to have spent your whole life doing it. That you can be
in late or something.
that you can be extraordinarily effective, in part because of your age. And that's one of the reasons that she was so effective. You know, had she walked across the country when she was 35, it would have been interesting, but it wouldn't have been interesting in quite the same kind of way, you know. And I've been thinking a lot about that. I think as I look around the world at the moment, on the issues that matter the most around race and around climate and the environment and around inequality, young people are doing a hell of a good job of organizing themselves right now. The days when people worried about young people being apathetic or whatever else are past. And what's rarer is what we have here on this call today, which is a lot of people of a certain age who are engaged in this kind of work. And I think we need a lot more of it. I'm beginning the process and really inspired in many ways by Granny D. I have her, it's funny, I have her book on the counter next to me, just because I've been thinking about her a lot in recent days. So when Karen Kimball called me to say, jump on the phone here, it was no problem. I've been thinking about Granny D a lot. I think we're going to be trying to figure out how to build a framework to get many more older people actively engaged in progressive politics in powerful ways. You know, our generations are going to be the first generations that leave the world a worse place than we found it, which is not a good legacy. And at the moment, if you look at our kind of politics in America, it's in older age groups that much of the work needs to be done, because it's the demographic that's preventing change, that's voting the wrong way, that's, you know, so on and so forth. Even though so many people of these generations had a pretty good, interesting first act in their lives, you know. These were the years when the world was being changed in many profound and powerful ways, with the civil rights movement and the women's movement and much else. Maybe the second act was a little more privatized, and perhaps not in all cases as engaged, but all the more reason for the third act to be a really powerful one, to be a place from which we figure out how to move the politics of this country further in the direction that they've begun to bend in the last little while. At the very least, the young people who are doing so much of the work, the Sunrise Movement, the Greta Thunbergs of the world, they need our backup and support and lots of power behind them. So keep tuned, and we'll figure out some more ways to try and enlist people and get them engaged. But just no one should doubt for a minute that the spirit that Doris unleashed on the world is absolutely blossoming and blooming and at full strength. And there's tons of work left to be done. And that's why it's a very good thing that we have great examples of those who've gone before us pointing the way about how to do that work. So many thanks for, you know, I'm sorry Bill couldn't be here because he's the best that there is. But I'm really grateful just for the opportunity to get to spend a few minutes thinking about an old friend and a really, really important figure in American history.
Thank you so much, Bill McKibben, for sharing your thoughts last minute and pinch hitting for Bill Moyers, as well as Larry Lessig. Bill Moyers was very much looking forward to being with us today, so hopefully we'll have an opportunity and hopefully he gets better. Today, we at Open Democracy launched a website called grannyd.org. You can watch videos about Granny D. Many are sharing in the chat a memory of walking with her. We urge you to write them up and post something on this site, but there is lots in this website to document her life and her legacy. The other thing about Doris is that she had a Vann, which I was hoping to put up, Rosie, that she called Rosie, and Open Democracy has acquired Rosie. And we are in the midst of working to restore Rosie. And so if you'd like to help contribute towards the efforts of restoring Rosie, there'll be a link in the chat for you to follow. And so the other thing that Doris always said is democracy is something we do. And we urge you to keep doing democracy every day. We at Open Democracy have democracy teams here in New Hampshire that meet weekly about what actions we can take to advance democracy reform here in New Hampshire. But also, as Dan Weeks and Larry Lessig talked about, how do we move HR 1 and S1 to Biden's desk to have the most boldest democracy reform that our country has ever seen pass. So we need all of you to keep taking actions, to keep remembering Doris, and to keep in the fight for our democracy reform. So thank you all for all that you do each day, and for those that shared memories. And with that, we will conclude today's program. Brian's going to put up some slides and some music to take us away here.
If you think you want to make a difference and move on to something new ahead, just you put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be doing just what Granny D has said. Whoa, whoa. If you want to get folks all together for a timely task to work as one, just you put one foot in front of the other, and you'll be doing just what Granny D has done. Walking down the road, doing something good. Walking down the road, she believed she could. Walking down the road, well, she's given us all a smile, and we'll be wearing it for many and many a mile. Many, many a mile. If you want to walk across the country, walk across the country, and talk to people in their towns beneath the sun, underneath the sun, well, you know you gotta put one foot in front of the other, in front of the other, and you'll be doing just what Granny D has done. Oh, oh. If you want to get folks all together for a timely task, you know it must be done. Yes, it must be done. Well, you know you gotta
Well, thank you all so much for joining us today and for all that you do to advance democracy reform. Have a great day, everyone.